I am going to share my screen really quickly so that you can see the presentation. Okay, for the purposes of this intervention, I focused on utilizing one-to-one sound and letter correspondence. This was designed and implemented by me in my first grade classroom. When I was selecting the project, I considered who would be the most impacted in my classroom. This year, we are focusing on a new reading and writing curriculum, and a lot of my students are really far behind in reading. So I wanted to focus on those students who would benefit the most. I decided that that was better than analyzing or intervening within the whole school because I don't really know the other grade levels and I also don't really know those other students. So I felt that this would be the most beneficial was to focus on my class specifically and not even the whole first grade because I don't know all of those students either. I had to determine which subject had the most deficiencies. As I previously stated, I feel that reading and writing is the area in which most of my students struggle the most. Math is pretty good for most of them, and so is social studies and science. So I decided to focus on reading. Reason number three is I wanted to focus on who my striving learners were. I have some students who receive ESOL services. I have some students who have attention deficits, and I have some students who have absences and they miss school a lot, so they're missing a lot of lessons. So I wanted to focus on those striving learners, which happen to be Ramina, Rylan, Sam, and Tina. Reason number four, I had to think about what is the cause of the achievement gap. The cause of their achievement gap was the lack of phonemic awareness. They are unable to attain to the first grade standards because they lack a lot of the skills that they were supposed to learn in kindergarten surrounding phonemic awareness, understanding the sounds, the letters, and how they go together to make words. Overall classroom performance, I based it off of the iReady screener. You can see here on the left side that I have some students who scored within the early one range for reading. I had a majority of my students who scored within grade K, and then I had four students who scored in the emerging K. Under the phonological awareness, you can see that three of those students scored emerging K for phonological awareness, and one of the students scored on the grade K level, but it was at the very beginning of the grade K level. For this reason, those are the four students that I decided to focus on because of their performance in relation to the overall classroom. When it comes to in-class activities and phonological awareness, we take spelling tests, we do dictation, and we also read decodable words based on patterns that we have been studying and tapping out throughout the week. Overall, you can see that a majority of the students score decently, if not exceeding expectations. On the first picture, you can see that 9 of my students, 45%, scored an S on one of the assessments, which means that corresponds to about a B. 8 of my students, so 40% of them, scored an E, which corresponds to an A, really 90 to 100%. So some of them got almost all of it correct, some of them got all of it correct. And then I have 3 students who scored a U, meaning that they got under a 60. My focus students happen to be the part of those 3. The second picture, you can see that one student scored an N, one student scored a U, 5 scored an S, and 13 scored an E. So even those 2 of my target students did not score an N. They were on that low brink of scoring an N and barely scored an S. In the third picture, you can see that 3 of my students made a U, 3 made an N, 6 made an S, and 7 made an E. So again, the majority of the class is passing these tests with flying colors, and some of them are passing and corresponding to about a B. However, they are still passing and not failing, making under a 60. This is very different than the 4 target students that I chose because these students tend to write random letters, they scribble, they turn in nothing at all, they write one letter and turn in the paper. There really is an inconsistency in their knowledge of phonological awareness, and it seems to be something new every day with them. And this helped contribute to my decision to work with these students. I'm going to go ahead and break down evidence for the target population. So Sam is my first student. I base this off of the iReady screener. He scored within, or she scored within the 10th percentile. Um, she showed emerging K for phonological awareness. She was unable to recognize or produce rhyming words, and she failed the last 9 skills block tests that we have taken. For names, she only knew 6 lowercase and 9 uppercase. And then for lowercase sounds, she only knew 5. And for uppercase sounds, she only knew 4. Rylan scored within the 6th percentile. He scored grade K for phonological awareness. He is able to recognize and produce few rhyming words, but it's very inconsistent. He has failed the last 7 skills block tests. However, he is able to name 20 lowercase letters and 24 uppercase letters. For his sounds, he is able to correctly identify 19 lowercase sounds and 22 uppercase sounds. My third student is Tina. She scored within the 2nd percentile on the iReady screener. She was showing an emerging K for phonological awareness at the beginning of the school year, and she was not able to recognize or produce any rhyming words on this assessment, which is one of the first skills that they work on in kindergarten. So that's kind of an issue. She failed the last 9 skills blocks test. She's not reading independently. She is unable to write or read words without teacher assistance. For letter names, however, she knew all 26 uppercase and lowercase names. And then for the sounds, she knows 24 uppercase, 24 uppercase sounds and 24 lowercase sounds. However, she is unable to blend these sounds together to write words or to sound out words, to decode words, and she requires that one-on-one teacher assistance. My fourth student was Romina. She scored within the 6th percentile as well. She showed emerging K for phonological awareness. She showed difficulty with letter-sound relationships, and she struggles to decode simple words. She has failed the last 8 skills blocks test. When I tested her right before I decided to do this intervention, she only knew 2 lowercase letter names and 4 uppercase letter names, and she knew 0 lowercase or uppercase letter sounds. However, it is important to note that Romina is an ESOL student who receives services. Tina and Ryland and Sam actually receive intervention in reading for 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week. The purposes of this intervention was to remediate phonemic awareness and student knowledge of letter-to-sound correspondence. The goal was for students to be able to use letter-to-sound correspondence to decode, segment, and blend CVC words when reading and writing. Additionally, I did throw in a little bit of instruction on rhyming, as that skill really is important in being able to manipulate sound. And considering that almost all of my students, my target students, were unable to identify or produce rhyming words, that did seem to be a little bit of a concern that I wanted to address prior to jumping into phonological awareness. So, as a research base of my intervention, I had to think about where I wanted to begin. What was the most effective approach for remediating reading instruction for this group of students, since they were so far behind in comparison to the rest of my first grade students? According to Sheffel, Shaw, and Shaw, since phonemic awareness is a skill that should be established in kindergarten, first graders who lack proficiency in this area need to have this deficit addressed quickly in the year as possible. So I've had a struggle this year of knowing where to begin with these students. I have the rest of my students who are doing whole group instruction, and they are tapping out words, sounding them out, writing them, writing sentences, decodable sentences, reading decodable text. And these 4 students are so far behind in their phonemic awareness and phonological awareness that they aren't able to attend to the lessons. So not only are they already behind, but they're getting more behind because they're not able to keep up with the pace of the first grade curriculum. So I had to consider where I wanted to start with this group of students. How do I effectively remediate these skills? How do I teach them and make sure that they're going to retain what I teach them? If they didn't get it in kindergarten, what did that teacher not include? What instructional strategies did that teacher not use? If they did not achieve during their kindergarten year, how could I do it differently to ensure student success? According to Sheffield, Shaw, and Shaw, there has been evidence to support that multisensory education led to accelerated acquisition of and increased student proficiency in phonemic awareness and alphabetic principle skills for first graders. For this reason, I chose to focus significantly on multisensory approaches, which is often correlated with Orton Gillingham approach. So I had kids tap it out using their fingers. I had kids say it. I had kids skywrite words. I had kids listen to words. They were looking. So they were using all five of their senses to provide more routes towards memorization in their brain, because the more senses you use, the more pathways are created, and students are better able to retain and retrieve that information when they need it to decode, segment, or blend words. This included things such as writing in sand using their finger or using a paintbrush. We used poppets to tap out words. And these are things that the students really enjoy, that are engaging, but also it helps students to use more of their senses to obtain the information and remember it rather than it going out the door or out their ear as soon as the lesson is over. Another thing that I had to research was, how do I help my multilingual learners? This is my first year that I've ever had multilingual learners. I've always worked in schools that 98% of my students are African American. So I've never had to teach multilingual learners. So I had to research how I could successfully help them to learn another language. And according to Luis Moreno, many ELL students arrive with a solid academic foundation, so their time is poorly spent remediating skills that they already have in a language they have yet to acquire. So I wanted to go back and see what it was that my multilingual learner already knew. Did she know the alphabet in her language? Did she know how to spell words in her language? I wanted to analyze that before I jumped in so that I could determine what I could build off of. If she already knew the language or the sounds and the letters in her language, how could I use that to benefit her in learning English? So, what does this mean for instruction? First, it means that I needed to work alongside the ESOL teacher. I needed to be aware of what the ESOL teacher was doing, what strategies she was using, what I could use in my classroom, but also to make sure that we were both reinforcing what each other was teaching the student, to make sure that that student is able to transfer skills from my class to her class and vice versa. I needed to determine the native language knowledge. Also, having high expectations is extremely important, because a lot of teachers, when the kids sit in their classroom, they assume that since they don't know English, they're unable to achieve at high levels. That is the first issue in students being able to achieve highly, because if you think that they're not going to, then they're not going to. I also researched and figured out that I need to provide side-by-side examples in native language and English. I need to provide visuals. I considered doing a reading partner program, which kind of ended up being a tutoring program, but it worked great because the student was paired with a fifth grade student who was able to speak in their native language, but also give the instruction in English. So that was reinforced, and the student was able to see the correlation between English and Spanish. And Luis Moreno discussed how there shouldn't be or alternative assignments provided. It shouldn't be giving them something that's easier, but rather giving them a different route towards achieving the same goals, the same standards. Another thing that I had to consider was, how do I help my hyperactive learners? Two of my learners in this target group are students who have a difficult time focusing. They don't turn in assignments. They rush through assignments. They're really hard to motivate. I learned that these learners need to be moving almost all the time. They might make careless mistakes. They might not follow through with directions. McAllister discusses how allowing students to wiggle just their toes or feet rather than their entire bodies could potentially accommodate the need for stimulation. G discusses how the uses of senses is a useful, productive, and motivating way to learn a foreign language, as all learners are involved in the teaching and learning process through diverse activities that catch the attention of the different learning styles when using a diversity of tasks related to multisensory tasks. So by providing multisensory approach to reading and using the Orton Gillingham approach, I'm better able to not only attend to my hyperactive learners by keeping their body busy productively, but I'm also able to reach my multilingual learners as they are learning the new English language. So, how do I keep these students on task? Well, we all know that they may talk excessively. And instead of just allowing them to sit there and talk about the sun being yellow and what they're going to do at recess, um, it's important that I provided them with productive discussions. How could they collaborate to help one another, to talk about the sounds, to work together to be able to read and encourage each other to continue working rather than getting off topic and doing backflips in my classroom? So, steps of the intervention included, I have an entire outline. Step one was 5 days. This focused on letter names and sounds, and then letter to sound correspondence lessons. There was an assessment that focused after 5 days. On day 6, there was an assessment on identifying letters and their sounds. Step two was also 5 days where we do consonant review based on assessment. We use Elkonin boxes with short vowels, and we use poppets to give that multisensory approach. At the end of those 5 days, there was an assessment on medial vowels in CVC words. Step three was 2 days long, where we focused on blending and segmenting onset and rhyme. We used Elkonin sound boxes, sand, paintbrushes. We use all of those different approaches to provide students. I'm so sorry. My dog is going crazy. We provided multisensory approach to teaching so that the students had multiple ways to blend and segment this onset and rhyme without just having to do it using auditory means. Then step four was 3 days long, and it included isolating initial, medial, and final sounds. Again, we used Elkonin boxes, sand paintbrushes, tried to provide that multisensory approach as well. And then on that 4th day, we did an assessment on isolating sounds. So could they isolate the beginning, the middle, or the final sound in words? Step 5 was 2 days long, and it included adding and deleting initial and final phonemes. This incorporated Elkonin sound boxes, sand, paintbrushes, poppets, so that students could, again, have that multisensory approach. We did an assessment on adding and deleting phonemes to form new words. Step 6 was also 2 days where we focused on substituting initial, medial, and final sounds. We used Elkonin boxes, sand, and paintbrushes, again, for that multisensory approach. Step 7 was 2 days where they focused on writing and reading decodable sentences. And then the final assessments, I'm sorry, the final assessments included segmenting and blending sounds, adding, deleting, and substituting phonemes, and writing CVC decodable sentences. From this intervention, I analyzed the data from before and after. As you can see, Tina and Ryland have a lot of green. They showed improvement in uppercase letter sounds, lowercase names. They showed improvements. One of them showed improvement in lowercase sounds. Both of them showed improvement in isolating beginning, middle, and final sounds. Then both of them showed improvement in deleting initial phonemes, substituting initial, and substituting final phonemes. Ryland still struggled just a little bit with initial addition of a phoneme, but he didn't perform poorly on this task. And then they also improved in blending, decoding, and dictation. However, as you can see, Romina did not make as much growth. She is my ESOL learner. She did not make as much growth. She made significant growth in her uppercase letter names, her uppercase letter sounds, her lowercase letter names, and her lowercase letter sounds. She was able to correctly identify 10 out of 10 beginning sounds and 8 out of 9 final sounds. However, she struggled with isolating the medial vowels, as she only scored 5 out of 15. She also did really well with adding and deleting the initial phoneme in a word. However, she did really poorly when it came to substituting initial or final sounds and phonemes into words. She scored 1 out of 13 initial substitutions and 0 out of 9 final substitutions. Blending was very challenging for her. She could sound out the letters, but then when she would put them together, she would say, man. So she still struggled to really grasp how to blend those sounds together. Dictation, she only got 1 out of 6 of the words correctly written, which again she knows the sounds, but then taking it from her brain and then putting it on paper proved really difficult for her. Decoding, she was able to decode 21 out of 30 words. So there is improvement. However, it's not quite the results that I would have hoped for. Sam, on the other hand, had a lot of absences, and she had a lot of tardy, so a lot of missed lessons. And as you can see, she really made little to no growth. She didn't make growth in any of the phoneme manipulation, blending or decoding. She was absent for the lessons. Dictation, she scored 0 out of 6. So it is very evident that her absences and her lack of attendance in the lessons is a big reason for her deficit in reading. Some of the successes of this intervention, first off, I do want to say that I believe that this intervention was very successful. 2 of my lower readers were very successful in almost all of the skills. And then my ESOL learner, while it wasn't as effective for her, she did improve in her phonemic awareness at least, and could still use improvement in her phonological awareness, but she did start to grasp some of those lowercase letter names and sounds, as well as uppercase letter names and sounds. One of the biggest successes of this intervention was that I did it in small group. It was more direct and more intentional, and it met the needs of those students where they were at, rather than trying to catch them up to the first grade standards. I was really able to sit down and focus on exactly what they needed, even though it's not a first grade standard technically. Using multi-sensory approach of hands-on, visual, auditory, those were all super engaging for the kids. They loved writing in the sand. They loved using the poppets, anything that they could use to put their hands on and really get engaged in the instruction, they thoroughly enjoyed. And I feel that it helped them to remember and be able to tap out sounds and figure out how to substitute or isolate phonemes within words. Another thing is that using visual aids, speaking slowly, and patience worked really well with my multilingual learners. Sometimes it's hard to do all of these things in whole group instruction. You know, when I call on her during whole group instruction, I have to wait to give her ample waiting time during the lesson. Sometimes I feel like I don't give her enough time because I have to move on and get to small group. So really being able to sit down and focus on this student and provide her with patience and speaking slowly to her, I think was very beneficial for her. And also, I think that it was very interesting to students. I used their backgrounds and their cultures, and I incorporated my ESOL learners' native language, and I tried to relate it to their lives so that they were very interested in it. And all of the students really enjoyed when we were doing the lessons. Some of the challenges, though, included the absences and tardies. It was very difficult to find a time where we could all work in a group, because I had kids who got pulled out for reading support. I had kids who were pulled out for ESOL. Then I had one student who was consistently absent and tardy and would check out. And then I had another student, Ryland, who was tardy all the time too. So really finding a time when there was not anyone out of the classroom and we could all be there together was really challenging. So I did have to make up lessons here and there and, you know, pull a student aside. And I felt like this caused there to not be as much fidelity within the implementation. However, I do think that the students significantly benefited from the lessons that they were able to attend. Also, there were the challenges of guesswork. Some students, like Sam, did not show much effort or perseverance. She very easily gave up, and so did 2 of the other students who get very distracted and don't really want to put forth the effort. So it did take a lot of motivation and redirection. However, by doing the multisensory approach, it did provide them more interest in the lessons. And there were still times where they weren't really trying their hardest, but for the most part, they did. Defiance was another issue. This had a negative impact on the amount of work that was done. One of the students is very defiant and would say, I'm not going to do that. I don't want to do it. And he wouldn't do it. So there were certain lessons that he could have benefited from more had he fully engaged and actually did the assignments that I asked them to do. And then the comprehension of tasks seemed to be pretty difficult for my ESOL learner, as she had a very limited vocabulary. So when I asked her to do certain skills, she didn't really quite understand what I was asking her to do, even when I provided her examples. So some recommendations that I um, think would be beneficial if I were to redo this intervention is first off to focus on language objectives. The purpose of a language objective is to help ensure that there is time dedicated for language development during the whole class setting. These are similar to content objectives as they identify what students are supposed to be able to do with the language after the lesson. So over here are some examples of language objective action words. So distinguishing, matching, paying attention to, finding, comparing, arguing. These are all the components of language that the students might be focusing on during the lesson that day. I think that providing scaffolds rather than different assessments is super important. During EL, which is the curriculum that we use for reading and writing, we provide different assessments for these students. But I think rather than doing that, we should communicate higher expectations through EL, because when we don't, the students automatically think that we believe they're going to achieve at a lower rate than their non-ESOL classmates. Also, I think that there needs to be time in the pacing to remediate and review prior year information. There should be more flex time rather than jumping right in and going into first grade standards. I think that there should be time to review the kindergarten standards. Do they have that phonemic awareness? Do they need to review any of the letter names, the letter sounds? Because if they don't have those skills, the phonemic awareness is the foundation of phonological awareness. And without that time to remediate those skills at the beginning of the year, we really are setting kids up for failure. That is all for my presentation. I do find that this intervention was very successful, and it did show a lot of growth within my students who were able to attend the lessons and really give it their all. However, I do think that there needed to be some changes for my ESOL learners, and I would need to find another way to reach my students who have attendance issues. But here are the sources that I use for my research base, and I really enjoyed this project, so thank you.